I wonder if you could tell us, in your view, what you would like us to be focusing on after what we all agree. We sat through every inch of it. Everyone in the public may not have. What to you were the most damning pieces of evidence introduced today for the first time?
So once the president had been told by all of his Republican advisors that he had lost the election, he was casting about for another way in which he could retain power. And he found Mr. Eastman's theory. And Mr. Eastman's theory was both illegal and illogical. And yet the president latched onto that and directed pressure at the vice president to get him to do something that was illegal, was unconstitutional. And it culminated in putting the vice president's life in danger on January 6th.
Congresswoman, my colleague Frank Figliuzzi points to the testimony entered into evidence today that Vice President Mike Pence refused to get in the car, not because he didn't trust his agent, but because he said in the testimony that he didn't know who was driving the car. Are you able to paint a fuller picture in subsequent hearings about just what Mike Pence feared?
I think we will provide additional evidence that we've gathered about this in the future hearings. But what I think that reflects and what you can understand from that is that he understood how fragile democracy was in that moment. He understood his role in certifying the election, and he was fearful that in some other way, they would take him away from doing the duty that he knew he needed to execute on that day, to the point where he wasn't trusting even the people closest to him that were charged with keeping him safe, because he did not want to be leaving that Capitol. He knew he had a job that had to be done and had to be done as soon as we could reconvene.
Congresswoman, it's so clear that you have the timeline filled out now in terms of what the White House, the chief of staff, and the president knew was going on at the Capitol and what Donald Trump did and did not do. It's something Congresswoman Liz Cheney has been talking about since before these public hearings commenced. Dereliction of duty is the word that she uses. Do you have evidence that he committed crimes in those 187 minutes?
I think that the federal judge, Carter, has already said that in all likelihood, both Mr. Eastman and the president had committed some sort of crime. I think that I would leave it to the Department of Justice to determine whether or not a crime had been committed or an investigation needs to be launched.
While these hearings this morning were underway, the Justice Department asked for all of the committee's transcripts of interviews. Do you have anything you're able to share with us about how the committee will respond to DOJ?
Well, we are in the middle of our investigation. As you know, we are still interviewing witnesses. We are still collecting information. I am certain that we will be able to come to a mutually agreed upon outcome with the Department of Justice.
Another thing that struck me is we saw tape depositions with two White House staffers who were deep inside the West Wing in terms of where they were in the chain of command. That's not completely clear to me. They seem to be a deputy press secretary and maybe a deputy in the Ledge Affairs office, but they had access to Mr. Mark Meadows. They were seeing the alerts of Donald Trump's tweets that in their view, seemed to threaten the security and safety of Mike Pence. How much, if you could just quantify how many and how much testimony you have from inside the West Wing on that day?
We have a lot of testimony from inside the West Wing, and you will continue to see it during these hearings. We have been able to lay out enough information to give you kind of an inside the White House perspective of what happened on January 6th. And I think it's an important part of our investigation. You'll continue to see the evidence as it's relevant to the topics of the hearings.
What was perhaps this sort of dramatic climax today was the evidence of John Eastman seeking a pardon, saying, I decided I should be on that pardon list after all. What is, in your analysis, the significance of John Eastman thinking he'd done enough bad deeds to need a pardon?
I think the fact that he sought a pardon underscores what he knew all along, which was what he was proposing was illegal, that it didn't have any legal basis, and he was trying to cover himself after the fact.
Are we still to be braced for new revelations about not just the White House, but the president's knowledge of violence as it was being planned and as it was taking place on January 6th?
I think you'll continue to receive new information that we have collected. But I think the thing that's really important to point out is that in the last hearing, you saw repeatedly that the president had been told by his advisors that he had lost the election. So it was clear he knew he had lost the election. He was told repeatedly that there were no fraud claims that were legitimate. He understood that there was no fraud. And in this hearing, you heard that he understood that the legal theory that Eastman was pressing was not legal. He understood that. So he knew all of these things, and yet he went out to his supporters and said the opposite in each case. He said he had won. He said there was fraud. He said that there was a path for the vice president to move forward. He is lying to his supporters.
So, I mean, that's a really effective sort of signpost, I think, for us. The first hearing established that he knew he'd lost. His advisors knew he lost. They told him that he lost. No denying that both he knew the fact of it and he'd been informed of the fact of it. On the Eastman memo, he was told repeatedly by his own advisors and Pence's advisors that it was an illegal scheme, that the Constitution did not allow for one man to change the results of the election, and he pursued it. And the third one is that he was aware of violence. He was aware of violence and a threat to the vice president as he's continuing to stoke anger and hatred toward the vice president. Do you, in your view, having just examined the evidence as a member of the committee, I mean, does this render moot what we cover as a debate amongst all of you in terms of whether or not there'll be a criminal referral? It seems that criminal conduct, that question has been asked and answered.
You know, the case that I think we're making to the American people as we lay out these facts and through these hearings is that we came perilously close to losing our democracy, and it was because there was a man in power who cared more about his personal gain than he did about his commitment to the Constitution and to this country. And I think the other thing that's important to note is that, you know, our charge is a legislative charge. Lay out the facts, provide legislative recommendations, and the Department of Justice will have the ability to investigate if necessary. And they have been investigating. They have prosecuted quite a number of people who were involved in the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. So they're doing their job. I imagine it just will be a matter of time.
But I mean, what we know in terms of their investigation is that it focuses on the insurrectionists, and then they feature prominently in today's evidence. There's no evidence that that has extended into Donald Trump's conduct that day. Do you think it should?
You know, it's what the Department of Justice is looking at is often under close hold and under wraps. So I don't know that you can say definitively that they're not investigating one way or the other. What I would say is that the big takeaway is that President Trump was not morally fit for office, and that as Americans we have a responsibility to secure our democracy by electing people with the kind of good moral character to execute on their duties and to commit to the rule of law and to commit to a peaceful transfer of power.